I have always been amused by a kind of a paradox. Suppose you go around and ask people, the United States, as you know, before 1914 had completely free immigration. Anybody could get on a boat and come to these shores, and if he landed on Ellis Island, he was an immigrant. Was that a good thing or a bad thing? You will find hardly a soul who will say it was a bad thing. Almost everybody will say it was a good thing. But then I suppose I say to the same people, but now what about today? Do you think we should have free immigration? Oh no, they'll say, we couldn't possibly have free immigration today. Why, that would flood us with immigrants from India and God knows where. We'd be driven down to a bare subsistence level. What's the difference? How can people be so inconsistent? Why is it that free immigration was a good thing before 1914 and free immigration is a bad thing today? Well, there's a sense in which that answer is right. There's a sense in which free immigration, in the same sense as we had it before 1914, is not possible today. Why not? Because it is one thing to have free immigration to jobs. It is another thing to have free immigration to welfare. And you cannot have both. If you have a welfare state, if you have a state in which every resident is promised certain minimum level of income or a minimum level of subsistence regardless of whether he works or not, produces it or not, well then it really is an impossible thing. If you have free immigration in the way in which we had it before 1914, everybody benefited. The people who were here benefited, the people who came benefited. Because nobody would come unless he or his family thought he would do better here than he would elsewhere. And the new immigrants provided additional resources, provided additional possibilities for the people already here. So everybody could mutually benefit. But on the other hand, if you come under circumstances where each person is entitled to a pro rata share of the pot, to take the extreme example, or even to a low level of the pot, then the effect of that situation is that free immigration would mean a reduction of everybody to the same uniform level. Of course, I'm exaggerating. It wouldn't go quite that far, but it would go in that direction. And it is that perception that leads people to adopt what at first seem like inconsistent values. Look, for example, at the obvious, immediate, practical case of illegal Mexican immigration. Now, that Mexican immigration over the border is a good thing. It's a good thing for the illegal immigrants. It's a good thing for the United States. It's a good thing for the citizens of the country. But it's only good so long as it's illegal. That's an interesting paradox to think about. Make it legal, and it's no good. Why? Because as long as it's illegal, the people who come in do not qualify for welfare. They don't qualify for Social Security. They don't qualify for all the other myriads of benefits that we pour out from our left pocket into our right pocket. And so as long as they don't qualify, they migrate to jobs. They take jobs that most residents of this country are unwilling to take. They provide employers with workers of a kind they cannot get. They're hard workers, they're good workers, and they are clearly better off. If you ever want to know how what people prefer, the surest sign is how they vote with their feet. Then there is no doubt how the braceros vote. They vote to cross the border with their feet, on their feet, or in any other way they can, by the thousands and perhaps millions, for all I know. Illegal immigration is fascinating because it shows not only the main point I'm trying to bring out now, how interconnected are the various aspects of freedom, how interconnected is the problem of governmental arrangements for welfare and governmental arrangements for immigration and other things. But it shows a very different point that's kind of a digression. And that is how bad laws make socially advantageous acts illegal, and therefore leads to an undermining of morality in general.
Welcome, everyone, to the Think and Reform podcast. My name is Luke Saint. Thank you so much for listening. This podcast is brought to you by Future of Christendom. Head over to futureofchristendom.org or check us out on YouTube for resources and podcasts, videos, debates that we've done, articles, and conferences that we're planning. And the voice you just heard there was the voice of Milton Friedman. Now, Milton Friedman, obviously, the several of the claims that he made are ones that we can look at and say, obviously, he was a liberal who just wanted, free immigration and all that kind of stuff. And he didn't know what he was talking about because everyone coming across the border is a rapist or a sex trafficker or a kidnapper or a thief and all that kind of stuff. And he was really dumb, and he definitely did not know what he was talking about. Okay, I'm just joking. I'm also not saying that Milton Friedman is right because he's Milton Friedman. But I think in that video, Milton Friedman correctly identifies the problem with the discussion around immigration. Now, this podcast, I'm going to be talking about immigration and some takeaways that I think are important, especially with the ongoing conversation with Dr. Phil Kayser. And you can find his articles at biblicalblueprints.com. Biblicalblueprints.com. Yeah, biblicalblueprints.com. He's got a couple articles about immigration and about this discussion that we're having. But Milton Friedman, I think he puts his finger on the problem, and the problem is welfare. And what really blows my mind with a lot of people who argue against free immigration, not open borders, is the difference. People who argue against free immigration, they are willing to dump all of our money, all of our resources, all of our attention into stopping immigration, which is impossible. It's never going to be stopped. You're never going to stop immigration. Illegal immigration or legal is never going to be stopped. They're like, let's put all of our attention and all of our time into stopping it. Stop the bleeding. That's the term they use. Stop the bleeding. They don't talk about that. You would think that they're talking about abortion, but they're not. Most of the people who are anti-free immigration don't really care that much about abortion. Now, they do give it lip service, and there are many among them who do genuinely care, and there are some even among them who care more about abortion than they do about the immigration problem or crisis. But the leading voices in Christian nationalism, for example, their attention is at the border. They don't really waste too much breath on abortion. As Matt Kennitzer on his podcast pointed out, Poking the Bear, you can go check that one out on YouTube, Poking the Bear. He pointed out that the guys over at Contramundum, like celebrating the fact that Trump is sending troops to shut down the border. Now, if you can find me a Christian nationalist leader who says, let's send troops to shut down Planned Parenthood, let me know, because I don't think any of them. Honestly, I don't think any of them care. I don't think they waste breath on that. Like, let's send troops out to. I'm not talking about find me a Christian nationalist, because I believe that there are Christian nationalists out there. I'm talking about a Christian nationalist leader who's disappointed that we're using the troops to shut down the border to stop the bleeding, right? Their terminology, stop the bleeding, the figurative bleeding, right? Because some immigrants are raping people, but Planned Parenthood kills 100% of their victims. Actual innocent blood being shed, not illegals coming in is not bleeding. If I'm a Christian nationalist leader who's going to say that's a waste of our resources, when we could be shutting down Planned Parenthood, we should prioritize shutting down the actual slaughter of the most innocent people among us, rather than sending troops to shut down the border. If you can find someone who criticized Trump's use of the army to shut down the border, it's not shut down. People are still coming in illegally, legally. It's still going on. You're never going to stop illegal immigration. So find me a Christian nationalist leader who is going to criticize Trump and say those resources should be used to stop the actual bleeding, not the figurative bleeding. And I don't think there's any out there. Maybe there's a guy who's a podcast or something, but I don't think you're going to hear anything from the Christian nationalists. I mean, they're all happy that Trump's shutting down the border. I don't think any of them were calling on Trump to say, hey, how about Planned Parenthood next? Or maybe you should use this to shut down Planned Parenthood. So if there are, I'm willing to hear, but I mean, after listening to a lot of these guys and reading their material, this is the abortion is kind of like, I think the Christian nationalist leaders have made peace with abortion. It's not really on their radar. But I mean, to speak for myself, I'm on the record. I think it is absolute waste to send troops to shut down the border. And I think those troops should be sent to every Planned Parenthood, and every single murderer who walks in there to kill their baby should be put on trial and given biblical punishment. That's what I think that the president should be doing with his time and his resources, just for starters. But Milton Friedman puts his finger on the problem, and he says the real problem here is not immigration. What changed where we were like, okay, it was good then, and it's not good now, right? The problem is that it was the free handouts. And I don't understand anyone who's going to waste their breath saying we need to shut down the border to stop immigrants from coming in here to get free welfare, when you could be saying, how about we shut down free welfare? Why don't we put our resources and our breath and our keyboard words into let's stop welfare? But no, we put all of our energy and our resources into let's shut down the border, which to me makes no sense. It makes no sense to me why we would waste our time dealing with the symptom of the problem when we can go right to the root, which is welfare. It makes no sense to me. I don't get it. We're not going to stop them coming in. They're not doing anything wrong by coming in. There's nothing wrong with crossing into a country illegally. That's not a biblically recognized crime. It's just a made-up crime. Okay, it's not a biblically recognized crime. God's not going to pull out the American Code and start judging you by immigration law of 2025 and start, when on the white throne judgment, looking down American Code and say, no, you didn't report to the statist magistrate who makes you answer arbitrary, ridiculous questions and makes you wait 8 years to come in here? As if they're vetting anyone? You think they're vetting people? That's insane and ridiculous. But there's 13,000, people bring this up all the time. There's 13,000, murderers, convicted murderers in the United States that are illegal aliens. From what I researched this morning, the average time spent by a murderer in our prison system is 16 and a half years, 17 years. Most of them spend about 16 to 20 years in prison. So we have much more than 13,000 convicted murderers walking the streets of the United States today of our own citizens than people coming in here. So what's the argument here? Why are we arguing against the symptoms of the problem when we can go right to the source and put our time and our attention into the source of the problem? It makes no sense to me that we waste our time and our resources and our political power, what little we have. When the politicians stick their head in the room in the Christian world, the unified voice they hear is shut down the border. That's ridiculous. The politician, whenever he comes to a Christian leader, what do you want me to do? What do you want from me? The same answer must always be given. I want you to do the same thing that God wants you to do right now. I want justice. That's what God always wants. He doesn't want you to regulate immigrants. He doesn't want you to protect me. He doesn't want you to make sure I'm paying my taxes. He doesn't want you to, give me free handouts. He wants you to do justice. And the message from God to the magistrate throughout the entire Bible is always the same. Punish those who do evil, praise those who do good. Do justice. Plead the cause of the sojourner, the widow, and the orphan. Listen to their case. Give people justice. That's what I want you to do. And so whenever a magistrate asks a Christian, what should I be doing? It should be, you should be doing justice. Forget about the border. Justice. Because it doesn't matter what kind of border protection you put up there. If we have rampant idolatry in the nation, there is no border patrol policy or immigration policy or wall that is going to stop us being taken over by these immigrants. There's nothing, because as long as we have idolatry, everything else is a wash. We must be focused as Christians, telling the magistrate, I want you to establish God's law and give people justice, because everything else is not going to work. It's impractical. It's the most impractical thing to argue for the state to fix a Band-Aid to a problem, apply a Band-Aid to a problem that they caused, rather than calling them to repent of their wicked actions, of sticking their noses where it shouldn't be. And the voice from the Christians in unison must be, forget about the border problem, forget about taxes, forget about tariffs, forget about creating a new governmental department. Your responsibility by God is to establish justice in the land. We don't have justice. The most innocent of us are being slaughtered legally. Let's start there. How about we shut down all abortion clinics and put people on trial for murder? How about that? But no. What we have is, oh no, some Mexicans are coming in, and some of them are rapists. Like, we don't have rapists here. Like oh, in America, there are no rapists. It makes no sense to me, the arguments that people are putting forward for immigration. Like, we need to protect this place when we have rampant pornography in this nation, creating rapists, encouraging rapists in this nation right now as we speak. It makes no sense that we are afraid of rapists coming in when you have a rapist living down the street from you. That's perfectly legal. The whole thing does not make any sense to me. But I said before, a couple months ago when we did our Future of Christendom conference, at that conference, I said my worry with Christian nationalism is not that it's pro-Bible. It's not getting its cues from what the Bible says. It's getting its talking points from the liberals. They're not pro-Bible. They're anti-liberal. And whatever it means to be anti-liberal, that's what they're going to be. And if being anti-liberal means anti-Bible, then they will do that too. They will argue against biblical law. They will argue against biblical solutions. They will argue against biblical morality, so that they will be anti-liberal. And that seems to me to be the focus. And I'll give you an example right here. This is from Right Response Ministries and Joel Webbon and some friends talking about the immigration issue.
Square very well with classical liberalism.
So I think to go back to your point earlier, Joel, part of this is that our definitions of what we see reflected in biblical passages even have been influenced by the way that the West has moved in the post-war consensus.
Time period. Yeah, it's our time period.
Yep.
It's been influenced by the Civil Rights Act.
Yep.
It's been influenced by globalism. It's been influenced by some degree of universalism, not applied necessarily to soteriology, that everybody's going to heaven, but I think it has been applied when it comes to an idea of what is a nation and what is citizenship and who are these things available to. That is just, my point is that has affected, I think, every single element of Christianity. So to stop picking on theonomy now, I guess my main point is not to say that theonomy finds itself particularly vulnerable to modernism. But my point is, at least at minimum, to say that theonomy is not invulnerable or immune to modernism. That just becoming a theonomist. I remember thinking that, 3-4 years ago, that if I was postmillennial and theonomic, that would be sufficient and make me immune to being a lib. But Joel McDermott is a lib. And he is still a theonomist. And so theonomy does not make you immune to being a lib.
And so do you see the fear? Do you see the fear of Webbon? I don't want to say he's afraid, but the concern, thank you. The concern, do you see the concern? The concern of Joel Webbon here is not that the position of theonomy is anti-biblical. He's afraid that the position of theonomy looks like a liberal talking point. And his main concern in this thing, and I think throughout most of his trajectory, especially now that he's abandoning theonomy, his his desire appears from what he's saying, and I think this is most of Christian nationalists. I think it's indicative of Christian nationalism. His desire is not that he's being anti-biblical, or that theonomy is anti-biblical. It's that theonomy, at some points, agrees with liberal talking points, and that's his concern, and that's enough for him to reject theonomy, right? Not because it's not biblical. It's because this looks like by embracing biblical law, I've now agreed with a liberal talking point. And first off, let me just say about the liberals. Whatever liberal talking point they have is not from a place of conviction. They're not convicted about anything. The only reason they believe what they believe is because they take their cues from the conservatives. If the conservatives tomorrow say, let's do open borders, the liberals will change. Okay, they don't have any convictions. They're anti-conservative and conservatives anti-liberal, and when they switch on subject, the other one switches too, right? So they don't care about immigrants. They don't care about any of that. All they care about are sexual perverts and killing babies, and giving those two groups freedom, and then putting everyone else in chains. That's all they care about. But as for now, they have adopted a talking point that is closer to biblical law than the conservatives. And Joel Webbon here is rejecting a biblical law. In my opinion, he's rejecting biblical law because it looks like a liberal talking point, not because. You should never reject biblical law because it looks like liberalism, right? That should not be our cue. That should not be where our starting point, right? We let the biblical law inform us on what's right and wrong, and then we argue for those things. If it happens to agree more on a certain point with the liberals, that doesn't mean we abandon the position just because it looks more like a liberal talking point. And again, the liberals, they don't like biblical law. They wouldn't know biblical law if they heard one. They don't care about biblical law. The only reason that they believe what they believe is because it's the opposite of what the conservatives say. It's completely incidental. It's not from a place of conviction. But that should be irrelevant to the Christian. I don't care what the liberal talking point is. I don't care what the conservative talking point is. I don't care what the libertarian talking point is. My concern is what the Bible says about what's right and what's wrong, what's just and unjust. That's what I'm going to be arguing for. If it happens to look more like a liberal or conservative talking point, it's irrelevant to me. I'm not in this for either camp. I'm in this to say, thus saith the Lord, and be a faithful ambassador for Jesus Christ, and to promote his law. The coastlands wait for his law, not Christian nationalist law, or liberal law, or if such a term could be used. So that's my concern with a lot of this argument, is that the Christian nationalism is chiefly concerned with yielding a point that looks like the enemy's point, right? And they're not saying, okay, is this biblical? Is this right? It's more like, well, the liberals are saying it, so they must be wrong. And that's my concern with Christian nationalism. And I think Joel McDermott, who's not a theonomist, but Joel Webbon appears here to me to be more concerned with this is a liberal talking point and less concerned with what does the Bible say about the matter, and we should adopt what the scriptures say. So with that, I'm going to go into Phil Kayser's second paper that he did. This is a response to the response I did a couple weeks ago. So what happened was I did a debate with Alan Miracle. Some people approached Phil Kayser and said, hey, what are your thoughts on this? Because Phil Kayser has talked about this, Dr. Phil Kayser. And so he did a paper on his thoughts on the debate. I did a podcast about his paper. And then he made another paper about my podcast. And now I'm doing a podcast about his paper. So it's a little involved. And if you listen to The Dividing Line, this kind of stuff happens all the time where, you do a response over response over response over response. So thank you for your patience. So here is the article, Answering Questions and Objections Regarding Biblical Immigration and Border Control. Phil Kayser begins this. This article continues the discussion of the four types of immigrants in Scripture that began previously at He gives a link there, biblical blueprints. So first, I think the biggest takeaway from this entire discussion with Phil Kayser, the biggest takeaway is that Phil Kayser is the theonomist that we should all be trying to be. Phil Kayser shows so much grace and so much class whenever he responds to people. I've seen people be so disrespectful to him, and he just responds with such grace and kindness and thankfulness. And I think the biggest takeaway in this entire discussion is Phil Kayser's attitude towards people that he disagrees with. And I hope someday that I can be as kind as he is and as patient, especially with people who are nobodies, who say, "Oh, I can't believe we saw that," and then he just responds with such grace and kindness. I think that's the biggest takeaway in all this. For me, that's what it's been for me. It's just being very impressed that he has got so much class and kindness and patience with people that he disagrees with, and hope someday that I can do the same thing. So thank you so much, Dr. Kayser, for your patience and your kindness. So he begins here, and I'll show you this patience and kindness. He says this: "I always appreciate pushback from friends on the things that I write, as it helps me to know how to write more precisely. This is true of the Saint family, whose ministry, Future of Christendom, has done good work. Some of you may well be..." Okay, let me just say this. Okay, a couple of years ago, maybe back in 2017, 2016, 2018, those years, the theonomic and Reconstructionist community was being led by people who, whenever they would finish an article or a podcast with someone that they disagree with, it usually ended with, "Since I disagree with this person, don't listen to him. He's a false teacher." And that's just, so many factions. Things were falling apart. It was a disaster of a Christian testimony by some of those leaders who have turned out to be Marxists and homosexuals, anarchists, and goodness knows what else. Biden supporters, of all people. So become Biden supporters, like actually praising Joe Biden for his wisdom. Okay, whatever. I don't know. I'm just telling you what I saw. But they would often finish their podcast or whatever by saying, "Since I've now proven the other side wrong, don't listen to him. He's a false teacher." And the result of that was just people where there's factions and splitting and all over the place. There was a lot of sowing of discord among brothers, and a lot of friendships were broken. A lot of people were anathematized, and a lot of people were just horribly kicked out, and horribly treated. And then in the comments, it was just war. It was a bad Christian testimony that these people set for the rest of us. Some of the leaders were great, but I think, like I said, the biggest takeaway from all this is Phil Kayser's kindness and class with people that he disagrees with, and that's something that has had a positive influence on me. Some of you may be aware that there has been a friendly exchange between Luke Saint and me on immigration. If you have not heard Luke's response to me, you can listen to it here. Again, just this would not have happened 4 or 5 years ago from some of the leaders. They would have just said, "Don't listen to him. He's..." not necessarily talking about me, but just anyone they disagree with, they would just anathematize and say, "He's a false teacher," whatever. That podcast interacts mainly with an interview that Kevin Swanson did of me on the Generations radio program, though it also interacts with this brief article, and he's linking articles and podcasts. For those of you who are not familiar with the debate, based on my own research on the distinctions of 4 Hebrew terms and the research that various Hebrew dictionaries, theological articles, and books have previously written about 4 kinds of foreigner, I wrote an article that barely introduces the idea of biblical border control. And to be fair to Luke, my previous email article had a couple of imprecise statements, 2 mistakes, and left out a lot of scriptural exegesis. So I brought into question a lot of things that he said. And I said at the end of the podcast, I know that he has more reason to think that he does beyond what he's written here. Because he says, in the article, I didn't write down everything and why I think the way that he thinks. He continues, even this article will still be fairly brief compared to the chapter in my upcoming book. It's going to be a huge book, huge chapter. In this post, I will try to restrict my comments to what Luke brought up in his podcast. So he starts off with my first concern in the podcast, why resort to Hebrew? Luke starts by saying that he gets a little nervous when people start bringing up the Hebrew in areas of justice. Are we really going to say that until we know the Hebrew that we cannot establish justice? What I believe is that anybody can establish justice using the Bible in their own tongue. That's what I said. Here's Phil Kayser. While I do believe that all my positions can be established using a literal English translation of the Bible, the reality is that the church has had to face multiple controversies down through history in which theologians have been forced to go to the original languages to demonstrate the truth of what they've been teaching from translation. For example, Martin Luther's discovery that the Latin Vulgate was wrong in translating the Greek metanoia, repentance, with due penance, and had a huge impact on people's thinking. It was William Tyndale's careful study of the original languages that helped clarify the meaning of terms that had changed over time. So he substituted congregation for church, elder for priest, and repent for due penance. Excuse me. These clarifications were critical in dealing with errors that had crept into the Roman Church. In any case, I am Reformed, and the Westminster Confession of Faith says, quote, the Old Testament in Hebrew, which was the native languages of the people of God of old, and the New Testament in Greek, which at the time of the writing of it was most generally known to the nations, being immediately inspired by God and by his singular care and providence, kept pure in all ages and therefore authentical. So as in all controversies of religion, the church is finally to appeal unto them. Phil Kayser says, I think Luke would agree that the immigration debate is a controversy that is not yet settled in the church. Yet I would still say that it doesn't take a degree in languages to realize that Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi mandated separation from certain kinds of foreigners, while fully embracing Gentiles who embrace Yahweh and his ways. And it doesn't take knowledge of Hebrew to know that the three aforementioned prophets supported the work of Nehemiah and Ezra, and when the 5 books are taken together, it strongly supports banishing certain kinds of people. This should immediately make the reader suspect that there might be more than one kind of foreigner, especially when the law commanded integration of some foreigners. Resorting to the Hebrew can hopefully crystallize what is already there in English, while brief articles like the previous one and this one can't get into all the nuances, and while ad hoc statements on a radio interview are even less likely to be clear, hopefully this article can at least make a stab at clarifying potential misunderstandings. So my comment on that one right there. What I'm trying to say with this, and my problem with bringing up the Hebrew in this discussion, is not necessarily bringing up the Hebrew in the discussion. My problem is that if what people who use the Hebrew argument are saying, my problem is that they can only appeal to the Hebrew language. They can't appeal to biblical law, because biblical law does not say, it's the problem is the therefore, right? So people, and I don't want to strawman Dr. Kayser here, but what it seems to me is happening is people are appealing. I've heard other people like Hoffmeyer, we need to vet people because there are 4 different or 5 different. I think we're up to, from this article, I think we're up to 6 different types of foreigner. Because there are 4 types of foreigner, we need the therefore is we need to vet people, right? Because they did. But biblical law doesn't call for vetting people, right? You just have to take that from an implication of a possible meaning of the Hebrew words to get a new biblical, basically a bureaucracy of how to treat immigrants, which the law does not call for. But the foundation of this argument is possible meanings of the Hebrew. And my problem is you cannot get this from reading the law, right? They use these different words. The Hebrew is using different words, right? But if I never knew about their different categories, would I still be able to establish justice by reading it in the language that I speak? And the answer is yes, you can, right? A knowledge of Hebrew is not necessary for establishing justice. And so I'm saying that when you read the scriptures, I would like to hear Dr. Kayser's argument. He says, I do think you can get what I'm saying from the English. And I think that's impossible. Get 4 different types of category and how to treat these 4 different types of categories, these 4 categories after reading in English. I don't think you can make that conclusion because the people who are arguing for it, they're all appealing to the Hebrew. And as you can see from this article, my problem is the only thing, when we're making this case for the 4 categorizations. If you read this article, it's a big maybe. It's a maybe. Maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. Dr. Kayser often says it seems, right? And it's possible. And what appears to be happening is, and he goes into, he's got 6 or 7 different theories about what the assembly is. We still don't know what the assembly is. And this is not a foundation. This article and the Hebrew language argument is not a good foundation upon which to treat the sojourner because it's a maybe. It's a possibility that this is what it meant. And my problem is that these articles and the getting into the Hebrew language, it doesn't make the matter clearer. After you read this article and all the maybes and the possibilities, and it's a well-researched article, it's at the end, it's a possible way to do things. Possible. And the law is very rarely, if at all, a possible thing. When somebody murders, it's not possibly we kill them. We execute them. It's no, you shall. Whoever sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. It's not a possibility. It's clear. How do we treat the thief? How do we treat people who break God's law? Chapter and verse, we know the punishments. Okay, there's no confusion there. The sojourner who comes to live in Israel has not broken God's law. There's no place where God tells us how to treat someone who came in here without talking to the civil magistrate first. Not a biblical way to think about it. And my problem when you bring up the Hebrew language is if I never knew the Hebrew, would I still be able to establish justice and I didn't do the 4 categories of immigrants? The answer is yes, you could. Because the law doesn't tell you, in the first 5 books of law, it doesn't tell you how to categorize these different people. At sometimes it's, you have to look at Dr. Kayser's 6 arguments or theories. Here, I'll scroll down. Luke had several objections to my use of verse 3 in the radio broadcast, and I totally understand that there's room for disagreement, especially on what it even meant by the assembly of the Lord. Okay, this is in my opinion, this is a big point, because a lot of the greatest example of how to treat the immigrant in the law comes down to this passage and what the assembly means. And Dr. Kayser's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 possible theories on what the assembly of the Lord means. I'm not saying he's wrong, but I am saying this is not a good foundation upon which to treat an immigrant. We cannot say, well, maybe it means this, so now you're not allowed in the country. Right? This entire article is not a foundation. And I'm not saying that Dr. Kayser is saying it is. But when you take a step back and say, well, okay, what are we arguing for here? This article is filled with, it's possible, maybe it means this, and maybe it means that. I'm not saying that we should reject the article, but I am saying the entire argument for using the Hebrew to establish justice in the land is a bad argument because it's a big maybe. And we cannot be treating people based on the latest theory. We cannot be treating people differently. The sojourner, whom we are commanded, are the top 3 categories of people that we are supposed to look out for to give them justice. We cannot be using possible translations of what the assembly means, of what the ger and the toshav and the nekar versus the nakri. I don't think looking to the Hebrew especially after reading this article, I'm more confused at what these terms mean. Because Dr. Kayser, again, is constantly saying, maybe it means this, and he's being honest. And I think it yields that he doesn't really know at the end of the day. It's a possibility. For example, in his original article, the term ger was a permanent resident who was at minimum willing to abide by God's laws and often believed in the one true God. But when Jacob goes before Pharaoh, he says, I want to ger among you. I want to sojourn with you. Does that mean that he had to adopt Egypt's religion? In fact, they were commanded to reject it. But how could they ger among them and still reject their religion and practice, the true Hebrew religion? The religion of Yahweh. I thought when you ger, you adopt the religion. And secondly, I don't know how a sojourner is a permanent resident. If you're not a sojourner, then you are a permanent resident. But if you're a permanent resident, you're not a sojourner. Was Jacob, when he said, we want to ger among you. We want to ger among you. We want to be ger among you, right? Was he a permanent resident? Were they always meant to stay there? I think they always had in view that we're going to leave this place eventually. But again, it's a possible meaning. Maybe it means this and maybe it doesn't. The Bible never says this is what a ger means. This is what it means. It's people saying it probably means this. This is our best guess. And one of the things that he says in his article, this second article, So I think Luke would agree the immigration debate is a controversy that has not yet been settled in church. Right. So I don't think after reading this article the answer becomes more clear. To me, I'm more confused because now we've added 2 extra. If you read the article, we've gone from 4 categories to 6. And I'm not really sure still what the difference between Nakar and Nakri are. It's all a big possibility. Maybe it is, and maybe it isn't. He says here, and speaking of Hebrew, I have a mea culpa. To give. Luke pointed out that I told Kevin that the Hebrew word used in 1 Kings 15:12, where Asa is approved for banishing the perverted person from the land, is the Hebrew word nadak. I should not have trusted my memory. I was wrong, though nadak is one of 4 synonyms for banishment. This verse uses a different one. I should have stuck to my notes, but since banishment is later a big point of contention, I'll return to that subject later. I first want to go through contradictions that he believes I have unwittingly held to. Okay, so he continues on here. Luke's first example of a purported contradiction of the thesis that I and other scholars hold to is an interesting one. Luke says that Ruth calls herself in a car. So the reason I said that was because in Phil Kayser's article, he calls Ruth a Nakar. And so I'm reading his usage of the word Nakar, and throughout his entire original article, he uses the term Nakri and Nakar synonymously. There's 2 places where he does that. So in his example of his original article, he says, Ruth was truly a ger, not a Nakar, though in her humility she called herself a Nakar. So there's his first mistake. She didn't call herself a Nakar. She calls herself a Nakri. And then, and he says that in his article here. He says, stating that she did call herself a Nakar is the second careless mistake that I made. Nakri means someone who looks different, whereas Nakar means a foreigner who is dangerous. But maybe it doesn't, maybe it doesn't. But for the sake of the argument, let's assume that she had used the term Nakar. Okay, so he goes in there. But that's my problem is that's not the only place he did it, because in the same paragraph. He says, both Zarim and Nakrim were strangers, but the Nakar stranger was more distant and more distrusted. Israelites were allowed to charge interest to the Nakrim strangers, right? However, when I go to Deuteronomy 15:3, it says, of a foreigner thou mayest exact it again, but that which is thine with thy brother, thine hand shall release, right? But again, the word there is not Nakar, it's Nakri. So it's the second time, and twice he used the term Nakri and Nakar synonymously. It's not just one place, it's two places. And so I just keep everything he's saying, I'm putting under a microscope. And the appeal to the Hebrew as a justification for immigration laws, over and over again, to me, it's just revealed to be a bad argument as a foundation, like as an appeal. I get that there's research into it, and I get there's nuances, but when we're treating the sojourner or someone who comes into our land, when we're talking about how to treat this person, using the Hebrew language as a foundation and their categories is a bad argument, because we just ultimately don't know what they truly and 100% this is exactly what they meant, because the Bible uses these terms, and the people who use these terms throughout the Old Testament, there are sometimes 500, 600, 700 year gaps between the way these words are used. And how do we know that those words the nuances didn't get in there, and the words kind of change meaning over time? Just like in the English language, you go back 400 years ago, how sweet and awful is the place, the term awful, right? That's what Wes Huff was saying, right? In the King James Bible. Well, that was 400 years ago. And awful has changed meaning. And I'm not saying this has definitely happened, right? But I do not think that an argument that appeals to the term, these terms, my question is, how do we know that their understanding of those terms didn't change in the 2 or 3,000 years that they were being used? Now, I'm perfectly willing to accept, I meant the same thing the whole time. I'm perfectly willing to accept that. It seems to me like that is the case, right? But again, this is just a bad foundation upon which to build law that appeal to the Hebrew categories, because we just ultimately don't know. And Phil Kayser's paper yields that we just ultimately don't know, because he's constantly bringing up, here's a theory, here's a theory, here's a theory, and here's my theory. I have the minority. It's a couple times he says, I have the minority position. I think at least once he says, I have the minority position here. And then later he says about me, well, Luke has the minority position, but we both have minority positions in certain cases. I just think it's a bad foundation upon which to build how for the magistrate to treat the sojourner. So it's in two places where Dr. Kayser is using the term Nakar and Nakri synonymously. I'm not sure if he really answers the question, how did Ruth get into the assembly? And I think his argument was the assembly was not indeed based upon, if I'm being faithful, or because it's a big article, but I think what he was saying was anyone, and I agree with him here, anyone who renounced their gods was allowed to enter the assembly, and whether you're a Moabite or not, you were allowed to enter the assembly. Here's one thing that doesn't make sense to me. He says, in one place, Luke pointed out that Ruth is still called a Moabitess long after she converts. I never pointed that out. I don't know where he's getting that from, but in that podcast, I never said that, because I know about Uriah the Hittite. It's just a way to say that this is where they were from. But I would never say, look, she was a Moabitess and she still remained a Moabitess and all that kind of stuff. As far as I know, I don't think maybe I did point that out, but I don't think if I did, it's not a good argument to say just because the Bible calls her a Moabitess doesn't mean that she still retained whatever it is to mean to be a Moabite. Note the Moabites are identified as one of the prohibited Nekar in Ezra 9, 1-2 and what was God's call with respect to those Nekar? They were to be separate from Israel. I will deal with the specifics of what that means under one of Luke's later objections, but here it is sufficient to say that even though Ruth acted in the capacity of Ger, Gentile, initially, in other words, she was still a believing Gentile, not a Jew, she perhaps, this is a bad foundation. She perhaps realized that as a former Moabitess, more was needed. Certainly the law required more, right? Let's continue on here. So again, in any case, based on Deuteronomy 23, 1-3, Moabite Gentiles would likely have been treated with more suspicion. Again, this is like phraseology throughout this entire thing. Maybe, would likely, seemed, perhaps, and this is, I'm not saying it's bad research. I'm not saying he's wrong. But I am saying we cannot use perhaps and maybe, and it looks like this was going on, as a foundation upon which to treat the sojourner and to categorize them with a big maybe. Of course, Luke disagrees with my use of Deuteronomy 23, 1-8 as being relevant to immigration because I brought up, like emasculation. Do we keep people who are emasculated and stop them from becoming citizens in the United States, that if you're emasculated? And so he goes into his 8 theories of which one is a possibility. I'm looking for a certain passage. First, a Gentile eunuch could not enter without full conversion. Some commentators believe that this did not apply to those eunuchs. Okay, so this is a huge argument on what the does the passage refer to immigration, and is assembly a one-for-one application of immigration or citizenship? Let's see. He says, I see only one solution, that Deuteronomy 23, 1-8 is a paradigm for immigration control. Again, I when you read that, and I disagree, I do not believe that is a paradigm for immigration control. Now, I do agree with him if he's talking about the same thing that I'm talking about, and I'll get in that in a second. Okay, so again, he goes here, but what about Solomon's prayer in 1 Kings 8? He says, first, the word that is used in both parallel passages is not Nekar, but Nakri. Nekar and Nakri have quite different meanings, but again, throughout his previous paper, he was using them synonymously. In 2 places, he was using Nakri and Nekar synonymously. And even the Bible at times uses Nakri and Nekar synonymously, because the Ezra and Nehemiah passage, one, when talking about the strange wives, one passage uses the term Nekar, and one passage uses the term Nakri. For example, when going to Ezra, all these have taken strange wives, Ezra 10:44, all these have taken strange wives, and some of them had wives by whom they had children, right? Ezra 10:18, and among the sons of the priests there were found that had taken strange wives, Ezra 10:17, at the end, and with all the men who had taken strange wives, Ezra 10:14, strange wives. And what's going on is it's using the term Nakri, right? But then you look up H5236, which is Nekar. When you look up that passage, the term used in the term used is different. Nehemiah, thus I cleanse them from all the strangers. The seed of Israel separated them all from the strangers. And so in Nehemiah, it's Nekar. At some point, it's Nekar, and at some points it's Nakri. The strange wives are Nakri wives that they were told to separate from. So sometimes the Bible uses them synonymously, interchangeably. And again, it's just like the appeal to the Hebrew language as a justification to treat and categorize sojourners a certain way. I think it's just a bad argument because it's a big maybe. Maybe they did. Maybe we're understanding the Hebrew correctly, and maybe we're not. We should go to the clear passages where it tells us how to deal with these people and these problems. For example, let's go to Bible Gateway here. Numbers. Here it is, Leviticus 24:10. Here is the result of when you live with a mixed multitude, right? Part of Dr. Kayser's case is that when they separated themselves from the Eber, right? Let me go to Blue Letter Bible here. And part of what his argument is that, I'm sorry if this is boring to everyone, but I don't know, I find the whole thing extremely interesting, and I am wrapped up in this argument. So I think the passage there is okay. Nope, it is. Let me just find it here. Mixed multitude. Okay, so Exodus 12:38 and Nehemiah 13:3. So Nehemiah 13:3 is, I think, Phil Kayser's argument for when they separated themselves. Now it came to pass when they had heard the law that they separated from Israel all the mixed multitude. And that's his argument for they actually kicked them out. They kicked them out of the country. See, it came to pass when they heard the law that they separated from Israel all the mixed multitude. See, they kicked them out of the country. It wasn't just Jerusalem. It wasn't just they separated. They kicked them out of the country. Here's the problem. When you come to this word, all the mixed multitude, the Arab, not Eber, Arab, E-R-E-B. Oh, that word sounds familiar. When we click on this word, it looks like it's being used here in also Exodus 12:38. So when we go to Exodus 12:38, was so the 12:37, and the children of Israel journeyed from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 on foot that were men besides children, and a mixed multitude went up also with them, and flocks and herds and very much cattle. Now, what is the mixed, that same word, what is that mixed multitude doing with Israel leaving Egypt? I thought they weren't allowed to be there, right? They could be separated. This mixed multitude can't be with them, but here they are leaving with them. Same word used in separating, right? And it looks like they were still separate here, but they were living together clearly. So, but I mean, this is the problem when you get into the Hebrew. It's just a big maybe. And we're talking about foundations of how to treat people. So. Oh man, I forgot where that rabbit trail before was going. Yes, here we are. So the punishment for blasphemy here in Leviticus. So one of the results of that mixed multitude was the birth of this child. Now an Israelite woman's son whose father was an Egyptian. This is clearly a result of the mixing of these two groups. And the problem is that when you mix these two groups, a lot of people point out, like when you mix these groups, idolatry happens, right? So we have the result of this idolatry. And the Israelite woman's son and a man of Israel fought in the camp, and the Israelite woman's son blasphemed the name and cursed. And then they brought him to Moses. His mother's name was Shelomith, the daughter of Debri of the tribe of Dan. And they put him into custody till the will of the Lord should be clear to them. Okay, all right. This guy just blasphemed. We know we're not allowed to, so grab him. Okay, Lord, what do we do? Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, bring out of the camp the one who cursed, and let all who heard him lay their hands on his head, and let all the congregation stone him. So the proper response to the result of the problems of the mixed multitude is never to banish them. It's always find the individual who committed the crime, and then you give biblical justice. Always the result. We don't see anyone banishing anyone in the Old Testament. Law never calls for banishment as a punishment to anyone. It's always a capital offense, restitution, flogging, and maybe a couple other small ones I might miss. There are kings who banish people, right? David banished people, right? There's banishing going on. But the law never recommends banishment as a possible punishment. We have to maybe go with a implication and an inference here, and maybe they did this, and maybe they did that, and here's a description of something, how they expelled people over here, but the law never recommends it, right? So we go to the clear passages. What's the crime? This. What's the punishment? This. Okay, we go with that. But this is a problem of the mixed multitude. How did they deal with it? Did they banish? So the perfect time. We're close to Egypt. We're not that far away. Send it back to Egypt. Can't do that. Kill him. That was the appropriate punishment. It's always the appropriate. God's punishment is always the appropriate punishment. But here we have the problem of the mixed multitude. This is a result of the problem of the mixed multitude. The problem is never to punishment, to banish anyone. And it doesn't make sense to me why anyone would argue for banishment. You have a citizen of the country and a citizen of Mexico. You know what? Guatemala. Let's go. Let's go with the worst. Honduras. Let's go with a citizen of Honduras, a citizen of the United States. They both rape a girl. We put together, the Christians will say, put to death the rapist, but the Christians will also say, banish the guy back to Honduras so he can go back to his friends and family and whatever life he had before. That makes no sense to me. That's ridiculous. That's not justice. That's not right. Why would we argue for banishment when for everyone that's citizens of this country, banishment is a ridiculous and insane punishment for anything? Give me a crime. Biblical crime. Give me a biblical crime, and I'll tell you that banishment is ridiculous. We're paying money to pick this guy up and give him a plane ticket somewhere else, or boat ride, or spend time and resources on this guy to send him back to where he came from, or to go live in another country. That's just. And again, you have a citizen of the United States and an illegal immigrant from Honduras. They both rape a woman. How is it just to put to death one and then banish the other one? How about you put them both to death? Same law for each one of them. Banishment just makes no sense to me. What I'm looking for when I'm talking about these things, as far as like this, I'm looking for this, like throughout Dr. Kayser's paper. There's implications, and doesn't it imply this? That's a question you ask. Well, since we're banishing people, doesn't that imply border control? I'm going to give you an example of something that I think is an obvious example of, or an obvious instance of what I think people who are arguing for border control are looking for. And that's in 1 Kings 15. Verse 16. And there was war between Asa and Baasha, king of Israel, all their days. Verse 17. Baasha, king of Israel, went up against Judah and built Ramah, that he might permit no one to go out or come in to Asa, king of Judah. Chapter and verse, border control. Border control. There it is. There's a civil magistrate practicing border control, right? It's not an implication. It's not a maybe. This guy was practicing border control. Baasha, king of Israel, went up against Judah and built Ramah, that he might permit no one to go out or come into Asa, king of Judah. And who's doing it? It's the pagans. The Israelites didn't do this. They didn't do border control like this. There's no instance of them doing that, as far as I know, in the Old Testament. But this is what I'm looking for when people are making that, like, we need to do border control. Here's an example of border control. It turns out it's not the Israelites doing it, but the pagans doing it to stop people from going to Asa for justice, because he was giving people justice. That much is clear. It turns out it's the pagans doing it, but that's what I'm looking for from a godly and righteous king. And I mean, full disclosure, that's still not enough because it's just a description. But can we at least start with a description of this at least happening? Not an implication of a Hebrew word. Maybe it means this and maybe it doesn't. What I'm looking for is something like this: that he might permit no one to go out or come into Asa, king of Judah. Border control. That's what I'm looking for. Obvious, no implication. There it is, chapter and verse. But there is no chapter and verse of this happening by the kings, doing this kind of border control, stopping people from going out and coming in and all that kind of stuff. But we're using the Hebrew, a possible meaning of Hebrew categories. We're using it possibly to say that the civil magistrate should do what Basha is doing, stopping people from coming in and going out without first talking to him. I think it's a bad argument. And I think it's telling that when we come and find people doing border control, it's not Israel. That is the way that people want border control. The Christians are arguing for border control to be done. When we find out who's doing it, it is not the Christians doing it. It turns out it's the pagans doing it. I think that's very telling. But again, this doesn't mean that border control is wrong, right? This passage that I'm using here. It's not a slam dunk. But I am saying I'm looking for where the law tells us to do this, what he's doing there, and it doesn't. It's not needed. And I think Dr. Kayser says almost as much. And if what Dr. Kayser is saying here is what we're saying, then I basically have almost no disagreement with him at all. Let me just find what it was here. It was I think it's the Tower. Okay. So Luke tries to dismiss the relevance of Deuteronomy 23:3's prohibition of Ammonites and Moabites in the congregation of Israel by pointing to the first two verses. Verses which indicate that those with crushed testicles and those of illegitimate birth were also kept out of the assembly. He had a bit of fun with me. Say again, this is Dr. Kayser's graciousness and kindness. He had a bit of fun with me when he asked if we are to seriously think that there were no border patrol agents making everyone lift their skirts to make sure they didn't have crushed testicles. And again, this is Dr. Kayser being so nice and generous and classy with his response, because I think a lot of other people would have been like, he splits places. I mean, they would not have been so nice. And I'm glad that Dr. Kayser took it the way that he did. I wasn't. And I tried to communicate when I was bringing up the example that I thought Dr. Kayser was being ridiculous or silly. Since that seems ludicrous, and it is, his conclusion is that since we can't vet testicles, we can't vet who was in a car. While clever, it assumes a modern system of vetting. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Watchtowers were looking for dangerous men, likely groups of men. They were not designed to be interrogation centers for every person who came across the border. As already mentioned, God's law depended on an active citizenry, not a police state that checked on everyone crossing the border. Agree. I do believe that the citizenry should be the primary executive branch. God's law depends on an active citizenry, not interrogation centers. And if Dr. Kayser is saying that watchtowers are good for roving bands of men, I agree, 100%. And if he's saying here in this paper, they were not designed to be interrogation centers for every person who came across the border, I also agree. I do not think we should have interrogation centers. And if Dr. Kayser is saying we should not have interrogation centers for everyone who crosses the border, then I'm right there with him. Then I basically, whatever disagreement we have is basically a nuance after that. what I think is what I thought was happening was that Dr. Kayser was arguing for interrogation centers all across the nation so that we can stop MS-13 gang members from coming in here and things like that. But if he's saying that God's law does not establish interrogation centers for everyone crossing the border, this is my whole position, what he just stated. I'm going to read it again. While clever, it assumes a modern system of vetting. Right, and that's what I'm arguing against. I'm arguing against a modern system of vetting. I'm arguing for a biblical system of vetting, which he says right here. Watchtowers were looking for dangerous men, likely groups of men. They were not designed to be interrogation centers for every person who came across the border. As already mentioned, God's law depended on an active citizenry, not a police state that checked on everyone crossing the border. That's my position. And I think most of the people who are arguing for my position would agree with that statement. Who were the people who were doing the vetting? It was the citizenry. Once you got to know someone, once you saw their actions, once you were able to prove in a court of law that this person was an idolater, a sodomite, a adulterer, a thief, that's when action was taken. What I'm arguing against is giving the state authority to set up interrogation centers for everyone who crosses the border. And if Dr. Kayser agrees with that, then I mean, basically, whatever he has to say is, I don't really care that much when it all comes down to it, because I agree. We should not have interrogation centers set up all over the place, because once you do that, I mean, you gave the state authority to reject people, say you're not allowed in here and all that kind of stuff. It's really the active citizenry that brings people, that vets people who come in here when they do something wrong. And the question is, well, what if a pedophile comes over here, right? What if a pedophile comes in here and you know he's a pedophile? First off, you can't truly know, because people have been falsely accused, right? And every charge must be made on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, if I was to go to a different nation, I was trying to get in, and that nation's government asked my government what they thought of me, I can almost promise you that my government would give me the worst possible description. So horrible. I mean, what would Hillary Clinton call, people who think and look like me? They call it deplorable. We cannot trust the testimony of a nation's government and nation's criminal justice system to accurately and truthfully categorize immigrants. Every charge must be established on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, and an immigration patrol agent cannot do that. It is impossible from an interview to establish a charge without 2 or 3 witnesses. Here's someone who's coming. I have no idea who you are. I don't know where you're coming from. I don't know why you're coming here. I cannot make a charge against you because I'm not a witness of anything you've done except that you showed up here. But people who argue for border control are like, skip the whole innocent until proven guilty. You are guilty until proven innocent, and I'm going to make statements about you without 2 or 3 witnesses, just based on some questions that you answered, or maybe the testimony of this pagan government over here. That's not biblical. That's not right. Why are we making the people who come over to our country jump through hoops that someone who's born here doesn't have to do? That's ridiculous. A Border Patrol agent cannot establish a charge based on an interview. Can't do it. Even as Dr. Kayser pointed out in his other paper, he agrees that you can't self-incriminate. It's not enough. It's not enough to establish a charge. Self-incrimination is not enough to establish a charge. So even if you're smart with your questions and you get them to admit something, it's not enough in a court of law. You had 2 or 3 witnesses establish every charge. And from an interview and from a vetting process done by pagans, but let's say they're Christians doing the vetting process, you'll never know. You'll never know if this guy is someone who's worthy to be led or not. You'll just never know. And a tattoo is certainly not, because people who have bad tattoos repent of their wicked ways. even if you have an MS-13, there's no way for you to truthfully, accurately know faithfully to that person if they should be let in or not. You'll never know. The only way to know is in a court of law with 2 or 3 witnesses about something that this guy has done with evidence and a judge. That's the only way to know. There is no possible way for an agent at the border who's vetting someone to actually know if this person should be let in or not. So I can't read the whole thing. But again, I mean, he goes into a lot of theories here. He talks about the distinction about Nakar and Nakri. And he says, third, whether we distinguish between the 2 words is irrelevant to the point I would making the New International Dictionary of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis makes it clear that Nakar is an entirely different category of foreigner than Tsar, the Ger, the Toshav, or the Nakri. Or the Toshav. And the Nakri is similar to a Tsar, different, unknown, not yet examined. Several other dictionaries draw out these differences. My chart of the 4 kinds of foreigners should not be at all thought of as novel, but again, it needs to be expanded to 5 or 6 because I think he brings up another type of foreigner here that's used. It needs to be expanded. I think that whole initial paper needs to be rewritten in light of the things that were brought up. That he's using Nakri and Nakar synonymously, and some of the passages he quotes do not even mention Nakar or Nakri at all. And I mean, it's just my opinion. I think the whole thing needs to be reworked. I think there's a couple of back to the drawing board points that need to be maybe that's just my opinion. Okay, so then he goes into I think 2 more points I wanted to make. Having given a mea culpa for specifying the wrong words, Hebrew words in 1 Kings 20:46, I will now address whether banishment is ever a valid punishment for anything. Luke seems to indicate that he believes it is not. Yeah, I still maintain that. I won't get into the numerous scripture that allows for lesser penalties for capital crimes, but the reader can find this in my booklet, Why God Didn't Mandate the Death Penalty for All Capital Crimes, a case for the flexible and restorative nature of biblical penology and the justice of the death penalty. But here I'll highlight the verses he questioned. And so he goes into his justification for the term banishment. There was one point I wanted to make here. Let me see here. Okay, here it is. The word used for banishment in 1 Kings 15:12 and 22:46 ba'ar is more ambiguous and could refer to various ways of removing the perverted person's death or banishment. Luke is correct that there are passages where ba'ar is carried out by way of the death penalty. If there were victims or other citizens pressing charges against criminals, there would only one option, the death penalty. But where the state itself is the one prosecuting the case for removal, I'm a little... I don't think the state as an entity should be bringing a case like it's the state against this person, like I'm representing the state. It should always be individuals, right? I don't think it's wise to start thinking in categories of, well, the state's bringing charges, like, the people against this guy or whatever. I don't foresee in a theocratic system the state bringing charges. I see individuals bringing charges with 2 or 3 witnesses, right? I don't think the state, maybe he's got a reason for it, but when the state itself is the one prosecuting the case for removal, there were no victims or other citizens bringing charges. There were no victims or other citizens bringing charges. The state still had options, and commentators point out that the meaning of this word can include the idea of removal. Again, maybe it includes the idea of removal. It can. It's possible. There's no solid foundation in this paper. It's a lot of maybes. Luke says that that this just removes the crime from one jurisdiction to another, but he needs to consider court proceedings that complicate things. I won't get into it here, but I'm glad to see there's ample evidence that this was a mass banishment, not a mass execution. But there's ample evidence that this was a mass banishment, not a mass execution. And I'm not saying it was a mass execution. I think the result was banishment from the land. People won't want to come to that land. They will leave voluntarily, and you could say, okay, they were banished. But I don't think picking someone up and placing them out of the country is a just punishment. I think it's a good result of just punishments. Like if you start, if you send troops to start shutting down Planned Parenthoods and putting the murderers on trial, a lot of people are going to flee the country, and in that way they're banished, right? So it's a good result, but again, you don't need to kill every single Planned Parenthood doctor to achieve this. But secondly, you could still have people getting banished from the land, and if they come back, they're going to be executed, or they're going to be put on trial and executed for crimes against innocent, for murder. So I think that's what was going on. But then he says, I'm glad to see that Luke has finally changed his mind about the need for Hebrew to settle controversies. In a second podcast, he has begun using the Hebrew. But again, this is not me using the Hebrew to justify what I'm saying. It's me putting everything he's saying under a microscope and disagreeing with his conclusions. I never said that Hebrew is necessary. I do believe that if you look at the Hebrew, it can be helpful. But I don't think it's going to change anything as far as what the magistrate's responsibility towards a sojourner. It's not going to change anything after you read it in Hebrew or English. It's not going to change. Still, one guy reads it in Hebrew, one guy reads it in English. We're going to come up with the same conclusions about the magistrate's responsibility towards the sojourner, because we go with God's commands. We don't go with descriptions and implications of the Hebrew language. So again, I'm not using it there. I never said that we need to use Hebrew to justify our positions. My position has stayed the same whether I read it in Hebrew or English. So that's not what was going on there. In any case, the English translations that I have on my shelf, only a couple clearly side with Luke. The ESV and RS, both of which translated as exterminated. And then he goes into several other translations. But again, the translations don't agree. It's another maybe. It's another possibly. Here's, I think, is a bad point by Dr. Kayser. And point number 3, in Ezra 7:26, Ezra sees it as a good thing that the emperor gave the following decree. Whoever will not observe the law of your God and the law of the king, let judgment be executed speedily on him, whether it is to be death, banishment, or confiscation of goods, or imprisonment. The word for banishment is sherushiu. And I don't think there is any controversy on that point. Why would Ezra bless God for putting this in the emperor's heart if it was a slam dunk violation of God's law to banish people? As my previous article and my notes have above demonstrated, the law of God itself allowed for banishment. But the problem is, I don't think Dr. Kayser believes in prisons. It also gave him authority to put people in prison. Why would Ezra thank God for the ability to put people in prison? Right? Was he really doing that? Does that mean we can put people in prison? Does the law of God at any point argue for putting people in prison? No. Throughout the scriptures, only the pagans put people in prison. The Christians the Israelites put people into custody to await judgment, and the judgment was never go back to prison. But it was for the pagans. But the law never recommends prison. When Nebuchadnezzar said, whoever says anything against your God, to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whoever says anything against your God, he will be torn limb from limb, and his house will be destroyed. Now, is that a good thing for the people of God? Yes, for the people of God, it's temporarily a good thing. But is that a just punishment for anyone who says anything bad against God? Well, no, because God's law just says that if you blaspheme, you will die. But it says nothing about your house. But here's Nebuchadnezzar saying that whoever says anything about your God will be torn limb from him, and his house will be destroyed. Well, what about his family? Maybe who didn't blaspheme? Now they're out of a house. Is this good? Well, no, it's not just. It's not just. And whatever human law is passed, it's ultimately going to come back and attack the righteous. And this is not a good argument for banishment, just because of this king who probably used banishment said to Ezra, said to Ezra, you can use banishment. Okay. I mean, what if he said, hey, you can use, mass execution by firing squad? Does that mean we should start doing that just because this pagan emperor said it? I don't know if he was a pagan or not. Maybe he was a believer. But just because this is basing the argument on a description, not a prescription. And I'm glad that Ezra was given this kind of authority, right? But that doesn't mean that he used it the way that we would use it. It doesn't mean that we should use it that way. Was it good that Joseph, as a member of, as a officer of the state, bought all the land in Egypt? Well, yeah. But does that mean that our government should be buying our land and that we should be giving a fifth of our proceeds to the leader of our government? No, it doesn't. The Israelites, when they completed a transaction, would give one person a sandal as part of their custom. Was that good? Yes. Does that mean that we need to do it? No, it doesn't. Description. And building our case off of description is a bad argument. We must go to the law and to the testimonies. If they be not of these, there is no light in them. And the last point I want to bring up here, again, we keep coming back to this one. Though this is not an important point, he challenged me on it, so here goes. Well, I didn't challenge him on it. I said in the debate there was no immigration policy before the Page Act, and I said 1882, and that's half true. It's actually, I think it's 1875 when they banned the women, and it's 1875 when they banned the women, 1882 when they banned the men too. So it's like all Chinese people, I think. And I think if you listen to the beginning of the podcast, Dr. Milton Friedman said it was 1914. Excuse me. So there's differing on the dates there. What I was saying was my main problem was that he equated my claim that there was no immigration policy. He equated it with, yes, there was, because there were citizenship requirements. That was my beef. But he doesn't address that here. He goes back to my original claim. But when I brought up in the podcast, my original beef with what he said was that he equated my claim of immigration to citizenship, which is two different categories. Were there restrictions on immigration prior to 1882? Not many, but there were some. I'm not saying that I approve of all these restrictions, but only to clear the air on what I meant when I said there were some restrictions. But he equated them to citizenship. Here are the ones I'm familiar with, he says. The 1819 Steerage Act required ship captains to report passenger data to the federal government. This laid the groundwork for tracking immigration, not an immigration policy. 2. Massachusetts and New York passed laws aimed at excluding paupers, convicts, and others deemed likely to become public charges. Massachusetts and New York. Right. Not the nation. Some states targeted Irish immigrants. He doesn't list any laws there. I do believe that they existed. Some states did, some states didn't. In 1832, Congress passed a law prohibiting the entry of convicts, and the states often excluded people with contagious diseases. I cannot find what law he's talking about here. I looked it up, 1832 law, Congress passed a law about convicts. I can't find, so I can't talk on this. Maybe it's out there, but I could not find what he was talking about. And then the Slave Trade Acts of 1794, 1807, 1820 gave various restrictions on the importation of slaves. None of these are immigration policies. Again, none of them. They're not immigration policies. These are rules about slaves, paupers, convicts, and others likely to be deemed likely to become public charges. But there was no national immigration policy to come live in the United States from 1789 all the way up to 1875. So Luke is correct that the pre-1882 era was probably much closer to the kind of free travel that you found in the Bible, but it was still immigration control. And I'm telling you, there was no immigration control. There's still no immigration. I maintain there was no immigration control, and so does Milton Friedman. Now, there might be some things that could be construed as immigration control, like some states targeted Irish immigrants, but I'm not talking about states. I'm talking about the United States of America, the country, not the states. There was no immigration policy by the federal government until 1875. Now, one more thing I want to bring up that some people are saying about, people who take a position that I take is that we're focusing on, you guys are focusing on immigration too much, or like, this is why are you focusing on this? What we're trying to point out is that Christians at no point should be arguing to give the state more power. At no point should we be arguing that. To do what the Christians want the government to do, we have to surrender more freedoms, right? And that's why we're trying to point out, you fools, what you want is security, not justice. That's what you want. That's what you're concerned with. And all these people, again, they quote that quote from Benjamin Franklin or whoever said it, Nelson Mandela, I don't know who it was, it's attributed to someone different every time, Edmund Burke. Those who want safety and security by sacrificing justice will get neither, or something like that. They say it all the time and then turn right around for, like, let's surrender more of our freedoms. Let's increase the police state so that we can stop immigrants from getting here, because that's the only way we're going to do it. We have to give the government more authority. We have to give them more power. We have to give them more taxes. We're sending the army down there, for Pete's sakes. That's a lot of money. We're trying to point out that the Christians are wasting their time, wasting their breath, arguing to give the state more power to do something God has never told the state to do. And that's why it's a big deal to us. At no point should the Christian community be arguing to the magistrate that, hey, we need to give you more power and we need to give up more of our freedom, because that's what's going on. You see what Trump is saying, I talked to Canada. They're increasing their border control. I talked to Mexico. They're sending 10,000 troops to help with border control. Now it's harder to travel between countries. Hey, we're keeping the rapists out. No, we're not. We have rapists right down the street. We still have the problem of rape in this country. Border control is not going to stop that. God's law is the solution to all this. And at no point should Christians find themselves arguing to give the state more power so that they can take care of problems that God never says this is going to be a problem for you. The problem was always idolatry. It was always idolatry. The death of a nation always comes down to idolatry. That's the problem. If we're going to be arguing as a Christian community and as a Christian culture, we cannot be wasting our breath for statist solutions to statist problems. That's wasting our time. It's impractical. It's asinine. We are the people of the book. If anyone asks the Christians, hey, what's the solution? We go, here's the chapter and verse. Here's the solution. Here's your responsibility as a magistrate. Your responsibility is not to go secure the border. That's not. Forget about that. Give people justice, and that will secure the border more effectively than any wall or any army that you can send down there. Establish justice in the land. Exodus 18. judge. Now obey my voice. I will give you advice, and God be with you. You shall represent the people before God and bring their cases to God, and you shall warn them the statutes and the laws, and make them know the way in which they must walk and what they must do. Moreover, look for able men from all the people, men who fear God, who are trustworthy, and place such men over the people as chiefs of thousands, of hundreds, of fifties, and of tens. And let them judge the people at all times. Not secure the border, not make sure we're safe, not protect our rights. Let them judge the people at all times. Every great matter they shall, but any small matter they shall decide themselves. So it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this, God will direct you. You will be able to endure, and all this people, including the mixed multitude that they were with, all this people will go to their place in peace. Do you believe that? Or you're like, it was good for them, not really good for us, bad idea for us. Argument? Yeah, temporary. Yeah, justice changes over time. And yeah, what was just back then isn't exactly just right now. Is that your argument? Do you believe that if we establish God's law and God's system, that we're not going to get peace in the land? How could they be any more or less wicked than we are? They were in Israel for 400. They were in Egypt for 400 years. Talk about pagan influence. We're so influenced by Christianity, up and down, left, right, 6 ways from Sunday. We are influenced by Christianity. We are much more prepared to institute God's law. Because most of the people in this nation think like Christians. We don't even know it. They just came out of a 400-year stretch in pagan Egypt. And they had this dropped on them, and they did it. And the first judge they had after Joshua, 40 years arrest. And surrender more of our freedoms and liberties in the name of safety and security. We've got to stop arguing to give the state more power and surrender more of our freedoms and liberties in the name of safety and security. Because the people arguing this is not a question of justice. They don't care about justice. Justice is not on the table. It's about safety and security. Stop the bleeding. It's ridiculous and it's asinine. Do we really believe that God's law talks about these things? What's the solution to these things? Or do we need more of man's political interference to solve these problems and make more problems for ourselves? That's all I have for today, my friends. Thank you so much for listening to the Think and Reform podcast. Head over to futurechristiandom.org and remember, think and reform.